Hello and welcome to Inside Grantmaking. I'm Alex Blake, a trust fundraising consultant with 20 years of experience helping charities secure major grants. In this podcast series, I'll hold honest, practical conversations with people working at grant makers to share how they work and what the big issues are in the grant-making field. Hi, Sufina. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us. Could you start off by telling people a little bit about your role and the focus of the work at the John Ellerman Foundation?
Great. Well, really lovely to be here. So thank you for the invite. My name's Sufina and I'm the director of John Ellerman Foundation. John Ellerman Foundation is an endowed charitable grant maker. We have an endowment that's worth about £150 million and we distribute about £5 to £6 million a year in grants. What we try to do is take a total assets approach to our work, which means that we are trying to use our grant making, our investing and our wider operations in service of our aim, which is to advance well-being for people, society and the natural world. So in terms of our investing, that means that we seek to be a responsible and social investor. And within social investment, that includes impact investing. And really, we're trying to ensure that our way of generating income and funds through our endowment is done in as much of a ethical and environmentally responsible way as we can manage. And then as a grant maker, our approach is to offer multi-year core cost funding. And we have a thesis that we can add most value through our grant making by supporting organisations that at their core are change-making organisations that believe in advancing justice and doing so in partnership with people and communities. And the areas that we fund in relate to the triple planetary crisis, polarisation and political inequality, and economic systems that are in service of people and planet and wealth inequalities. And the fourth area is a recognition of the fact that within all three of those areas, there are some groups that are more impacted than others. And so there may be ways in which you might be working on the triple planetary crisis in relation to a specific group or community that's more impacted. And my role as director or chief executive of the foundation is to oversee and ensure that the work we're doing through our grant making and investing is in service of our overarching strategy, which runs from 2025 to 2030.
Yeah. Apologies to any listeners if the sound of the plane going overhead got picked up at all there. I'm right under the flight path here, so it sounds dead loud to me, but it's probably not got picked up anyway. When you mentioned about it being for change-making organisations, is that, do you define that as being about sort of changing policy and systems as opposed to like delivering services?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. Our approach is about systems change, but we recognise that change happens in many ways. And so we kind of, as a shorthand, describe it as inside track and outside track approaches. So we know that there are these tried and tested inside track approaches that many of your listeners will be familiar with. And you mentioned one just there about policy change, and that could be within central government through all party parliamentary groups or trying to influence different pieces of legislation. But there's also this so-called outside track approach, which is much more about community organising, building community power and working from the ground up to create change, as well as other versions of change that exist within the inside and outside track. But that's the approach that we take. So we have got a real openness to a range of methodologies. We recognise that within the organisations that we support, they might be doing direct service delivery, but our funding will be very much directed towards how all of that comes together to make change happen. And so we don't fund direct service delivery necessarily, but we recognise it's very much part of how change can happen.
Yeah, okay. And so because you do unrestricted funding, those organisations that do both the frontline delivery and the sort of systems change stuff, do you have to restrict to the area that you're focused on, or does it you just consider it being like it's all part of leading towards making that change? Because it's interconnected, you just fund the whole organisation.
So we do have a lot of demand for our funding, and I'm sure that's not news to you. And so we offer core cost funding that's multi-year, and we have very light framing around which we'll ask organisations to focus our funding within their organisation. And so it's often core cost towards the leadership team, core cost towards the policy team, and so on and so forth. So we don't tend to be funding the direct service delivery directly because that's not what our funding is used for. But we recognise that there may be other funders supporting that element of the work that's happening within an organisation. Increasingly, change making does have a practical element to it. And so we are funding that through the approach that we take, but we might not be funding a project A which has A, B, C and D outcomes.
And on the investment side that you mentioned as well, does that include like sort of making social investments that people approach you for, or is it just on the kind of like the investment management side of things that you kind of consider where that money's going?
So this has been a really exciting part of our journey over the last 6.5 years as an organisation. So we very much started on the responsible investing side of things. So what would it take for our endowment to be invested in ways via our fund managers that considered the environmental and ethical implications of how we were making our money? So we've done a lot of work trying to improve the way in which fund managers understand those implications and consider them when deciding which equity to invest us in and why. And we've also done a lot of work around how you can engage with the underlying assets and how you can try to drive forward better behaviours within those companies, as well as then sometimes having to remove yourselves from being invested in those companies. But it's a twin track approach. So alongside the work that is very much ongoing and laborious and it takes a lot of time, on the responsible investing side of things, we have introduced in the last couple of years a clear approach to social investing. And so we have a carve out within our endowment that's available for social investments. Both our responsible investment policy and our social investment policy are publicly available on our website. And the social investments can include, as you say, direct investments. So organisations that either come to us or we become aware of through different networks and advice that we receive. And we can make those investments. An example of that would be Micro Rainbow that we're already invested in. But we can also be invested in pooled funds or different kind of vehicles or models that are social investments. And we made one such investment earlier this year, which is Eco Ventures, and it's to do with responsible consumerism.
Yeah, it's an interesting side of the work. Coming back to the grant making side, it'd be great to just walk through the process from an applicant starting the beginning of the process and then understanding how that then works from the grant assessing side once the application's been received and process it goes through within your organisation.
Yeah, happy to do that. And pretty much everything I'm about to say on our website, we try and be as transparent and clear as we can be about what it is that our application process involves. And that includes, for example, we have a full document that says every single question and every bit of information that we'll request from you as part of the application process. So you can determine for yourself whether you have that information or whether you want to participate in the process. We also have on our website a detailed overview of how we do our reporting. So again, you can make that judgment about whether you want to be working with us and whether you have the availability and time to do that. So I will talk you through it start to finish, so bear with. So we do offer quite a lot of pre-application support in a range of different ways. So a lot of our information, as I said, is on the website, including funding guidelines and FAQs and quizzes that show if you're eligible or not eligible. So that's the first port of call, the shop window, if you like, is our website. If you can't get the information that you need, or if you still have questions, which is perfectly fine and fair, then we just ask that you have a couple of options you can use. So the one option is we have a monthly online Q&A session where members of our team present our approach and then take questions and answers. And often, if you've got a few questions, they'll get answered very quickly, and that's once a month, as I say. The other option is that we have 2 members of our team that are the first port of call for all application inquiries, and they'll either answer those over email, a quick phone call, or if they feel that a bit of a longer discussion is needed, then they can set up a 30 or 45-minute pre-application discussion with you. And there is the option of just picking up the phone and they will answer. Obviously, if they're in meetings, they won't. So we do put a lot of energy and effort into our pre-application support because we want to give people as much support and advice as we can. And we do try and be quite proportionate too, in that we know that some of the organisations that we fund won't have dedicated staff resource for making applications, and so we'll need a bit more help. And then other organisations, of course, will have qualified staff and teams, and they may need a bit less of support as a result.
With all of that sort of pre-application support, do you find, if you have the figures, does that improve the kind of success rates in terms of how many of your applicants are then getting through to funding compared to other, I don't know if you have a kind of benchmark of what other types of organisations like yourselves would be kind of?
So we've never not worked like this, so it's hard to compare or contrast. Obviously, it's harder to get a sense of what it means for other organisations. I think because the volumes are a lot higher across a lot of funders, we're all seeing that the success rates are going down as a result. I think what we're finding with the approach that we take is that we have quite a high proportion that are ineligible. So people, even with all the information and advice that we provide, are still taking a punt because our process isn't that rigorous, or not rigorous is not the right word, as onerous as some organisations. And so they'll just push an application in, but it will ultimately be ineligible. But the success rates on first and second stage are higher. And I do think that is because of the pre-application support we're providing. And one of the things we always say is that whilst not all of our peers can offer as much pre-application support as we do, and I'm not saying, we're like the best in offering the most by any means, but the point we make is that a lot of our peers will have similar processes and approaches. So even if it doesn't work out for your application with us, it might work out for an application with another trust or foundation that you're applying to. So that's the first point. And so eligibility is really key. Are you eligible or not eligible? If we deem you're not eligible, we will send you an email explaining why we don't think you're eligible. And then, that's the end of the journey. But if you go beyond that, you're in our first stage process. So the first stage application, which we deem is eligible or not eligible, comprises general organisational information. So things like name of your organisation, number of staff, charity number or equivalent if you're not registered as a charity. We do ask for a bit of information if you choose not to be registered as a charity, as to kind of what your rationale for that is. If there's anything about your financial information that you'd want to explain because it's not quite in line with a policy, we also give you a bit of space to do that. And then we ask for 2 sides of A4 where we ask you to answer 4 questions relating to our funding guidelines. And it's a bit kind of in a nutshell, a bit of an introduction to your organisation, what you do and why, and how you fit with our guidelines. That's basically it in a nutshell. And you get 2 sides of A4 to do that. And then we're part of a wider process called the DEI data standard, which is diversity, equity and inclusion data standard. And we ask you to submit your information in relation to that. That bit of our application is not assessed, though. We only are capturing that data for monitoring processes in aggregate as opposed to grant by grant. So at that first stage, if you are eligible, you're then assessed by a member of the team who essentially goes through our guidance and your application and provides a summary report about, is your organisation well run? Do you have a clear approach to change making and is it impactful? How are you relating to one of the areas or one or more of the areas that we want to fund work in? And then some concluding statements and an overarching recommendation. That's then reviewed by trustees and they take forward the applications based on the budget available and the quality of the applications received. So that's the first stage. And because we're open all year round, we do that kind of assessment with trustees once a month. And just to give you a bit of a sense of what we're dealing with in terms of volumes, we might get up to 40 to 60 applications. Not all of those will be eligible. So some will be taken out at eligibility and informed that that's the decision taken and why we've decided they're ineligible. The remainder will get that assessment that I've just described and then that review and decision making by trustees. We might have anywhere between 15 and 30 applications for consideration, sometimes more, but I'm just saying 15 to 30 is a general range. And that could then result in us only having the budget available to take forward about 3 or 4 applications. It's high stakes in terms of what we're able to do and what we have available. If you do go forward to the second stage, you're given 4 weeks to make your second stage application. We ask for a bit more financial information, safeguarding policy, your environmental sustainability policy, and then instead of 2 sides of A4, you're given 4 sides of A4 in which to provide an overview of the work that you're doing and why it's a good fit with the work that we're trying to do. And you're also asked for some outcomes in relation to your application. That then is submitted by the organisation. It's sent to our visiting trustee because all of our second stage applications result in a meeting between our organisation and the applicant organisation. That meeting is always, mostly always, not always, but mostly run by one of our trustees, and they meet with you, they have conversation, they ask you stuff about your organisation, the work you're doing, the approach you're taking, your track record, your impact, any risks or issues you're dealing with, and so on and so forth. The visiting trustee then writes that up into a report that goes to the board, and the board then takes a joint group decision based on the trustee's recommendation and the paperwork that's been received from the applicant organisation. At second stage, the success rate is a lot higher, and generally speaking, nearly all of our applications go through. Obviously, some don't, because at that second stage, we realise that we're not the right organisation to be funding the applicant. Once you have a grant from us, you get a dedicated named point of contact or grant manager who is your person throughout the course of your grant with us. Your payment is set up quite quickly after the decision is taken, so your first payment, and then we'll talk through things like your reporting and, all that's set out in the offer letter. And we also make sure that, after 6 months, we do a little check-in point, because obviously in the rush and melee of applying, things can change, or, you're probably making multiple applications at the same time. So we kind of just check back in after the dust has settled a bit, just to say, just want to be clear, we've got the right point of contact. You know who your point of contact is in the organisation. How are things going? Are you clear on what our working relationship is? And so on and so forth. So that's kind of the process end to end. And then it moves into reporting. And we only ask for reports once a year. And once we receive the report and review it, that's when we release your next payment.
Yeah. And on that second stage application, success rates there, are they like 50% or something?
No,
higher
much
than
higher. So more like 90%.
So where you've got budget for funding like 3 or 4 of those applications, you'd only be taking 5 or 6 or something through from that first stage.
Yeah. I mean, we sometimes take out forward more than we can afford, but we generally try to take forward what we can afford. If we're in the position where we're taking forward more than we can afford, it's because the applications we've received, we think there's something there, but they might not be a fit. And we think that we can then resolve that through a second stage discussion. But yeah, the success rate at second stage is like 90% or above. So we recognise the time commitment to making applications. We feel that our application process isn't overly onerous, but obviously at the second stage, more is required, including this meeting or visit with one of our trustees. And so we don't want to put organisations through that if we just don't know going into it, we don't have the budget to fund them. So we do have to be very discerning at first stage where the success rate is a lot lower. And we try and make sure that at every stage of our decision making, so if you're rejected at first stage, you're given reasons as to why. If you're rejected at second stage, you're given reasons as to why. So you will always have clarity on why we've decided not to fund you.
Particular things that stand out in terms of the applications that make it through? I know obviously some of the key, like how well they fit with what you're looking to focus on and those sort of things, but are there sort of particular things that stand out for you?
So obviously I recognise completely that every application process has a huge power dynamic involved. And I think sometimes organisations that are applying to us are trying to write in a way that they are saying what they think we want to hear. And for me and for the team, I would say, and trustees as well, the thing that really stands out is the organisations that apply and are very much authentically themselves and aren't trying to speak or write in ways that they think we want to hear. So the applicants that can say unequivocally and clearly in their own words, this is what we do, this is what we stand for, this is why we want to get funding from you, are probably the ones that resonate the most. Whereas those that think, okay, well, I've got to use this word because we think that's the word that they want to hear, just ends up being a little less clear about what the fit is. We do have our funding guidelines on our website as well, and we try and speak as clearly and plainly as we can in those. And so again, just applications where it's very clear that people have read the funding guidelines, seen a connection and been able to articulate that connection, obviously come across much more strongly than those that perhaps have not read or connected with the guidelines as deeply. And then I do think that the organisations that are just really clear on, for us, we're looking for organisations that at their core are change-making organisations, have a thesis on what it means to advance justice in partnership with people and communities. And those organisations are able to demonstrate and evidence that really deeply, meaningfully and impactfully in ways that if you're kind of trying to contort yourself into the guidelines because you're not quite doing those things, but maybe at a pinch you are, then it's probably less strong or resonates less as an application. So I think the ones that are authentic, clearly connected with the funding guidelines are always the strongest.
Yeah. And do you look outside of that application that's presented to you? Like, do you also, I'm sure you check the annual report in terms of the figures and things, but do you look at what's being written in the report and look on the website and see all of those lines?
Yeah, so we do ask as part of the application submission at first stage that you provide us with your annual report and accounts. And if that's older than 10 months, then we also ask for your most recent edition of your management accounts. But we're not just asking for the annual report and accounts so that we can look at the figures. We're also looking at the narrative. We do look at the website, and within applications, we have an FAQ about this, which says that if you want to share some links, hyperlinks to different things that you're referencing within the 2 sides of A4 that you've written, then do include those. And we might not click on every single link, but we will click on some of them and be able to use that as part of our assessment and decision making. Of course, if you submit an application that is one giant hyperlink, every single word has a link, then no, we're not going to be able to connect with it in that level of detail. So the core piece that you're submitting is that 2 sides of written A4, but you are also submitting your annual report and accounts that we do engage with, not just for the figures, but for the narrative as well. And we will be looking at your website and other things as well. So yeah, it is a multi-pronged approach.
How big an impact can the website have on that process, do you think?
Well, I guess so much of grant making is judgments and decision making, isn't it? And so we do try and keep things right-sized, insofar as recognising that, we fund organisations that have an income of between £100,000 and £10 million a year. So inevitably, that's quite a range, and the expectations of a website for an organisation that's much smaller versus one that's much bigger will be different. There's an element of, yes, the website is useful. Yes, the external kind of information about an organisation is useful, but we do try and keep it right-sized, recognising that lots of organisations are dealing with many, many different priorities, and all of them are kind of urgent in their own different ways. And so I think we have to make good judgments about the information that is available and its quality, and use that to support our assessments. It wouldn't live or die by a poor website. Obviously, we may note that, but we would also be assessing it in the round alongside the other things that we're considering when taking the decision. And for us, one of the things where we see a lot of weaker applications coming through is when they're not able to show us a track record and show us, if you want to do this now, where has that come from? Like, what is the story, the journey, the through line, the track record that you're building on that means that you want to do this piece of work now? Also, why now? Like, what is it responding to in terms of the context around you, and where next? And sometimes we don't get that story. And sometimes that will be on our website, and other times it will be in other places. And other times it just won't be there at all. And it makes it very hard for us to make an assessment or a decision as to whether we should fund you, other than to say probably not.
And so once you've funded an organisation, as you said, you set up a key point of contact, and you have, I think it's just annual reporting, you said. What sort of relationship do you have with organisations? Is it quite hands-off, light touch, just have the reports there to check that everything's going to plan and pick up any learning, or are you more involved having some connection with the organisation, maybe providing some additional support, maybe doing some of that convening or making introductions, sharing learning, all of that stuff?
So in a nutshell, we would describe ourselves as a light touch funder. We have 6 staff in total working in our organisation, and we have 3 people working on grants full time. I work on grants for part of my time. It's not the full amount of time in my working week that I use for grant making. Across the 4 of us who manage grants, we have portfolios that range in size from 20 to about 60 grants. As you can see from those numbers alone, we can't be super hands-on, super involved and constantly engaging with every single grant holder, and nor would we want to be, and nor do I think our grant holders would want us to be. So it's finding the right balance. But within a portfolio, we will find ways in which some grant holders may require a bit more of our time, and others, especially if they maybe have been funded by us previously or are very used to working with trusts and foundations more generally, will need a little bit less from us. That said, when you submit a progress report to us, one of the things you will absolutely be crystal clear on is that the team and I will have sat down, read your progress report, engaged with it, and give you a response in an email that really shows that. Like, we'll ask you questions, or we'll acknowledge what you've been dealing with and how you've been working on it, and not asking you questions as in we're not releasing this payment, but just kind of saying, how are things going? You had to deal with X, Y, and Z. I hope everyone's all right, or whatever it might be. So it's not just a kind of thanks for your progress report, your payment is coming in the next payment run. It's a little bit more engaged than that. With our new strategy, we are starting to trial and build up our capacity around connecting and convening with our grant holders rather than one-to-one, but in more groupings around, like, if we're finding certain themes or repeating pattern, how can we connect grant holders so that they can spend a bit of time together and learn from each other. It's very early days. We're only 15 grants into our new strategy. So that's not really up and running, but it will be. And it's one of the ambitions that we feel is very deliverable as part of our next strategy. And then the other thing that we're trying to do through our grant making is use the learning that we're getting from our reporting and getting it back out into the system as quickly as we can, in terms of having a kind of annual snapshot report, if you like, of this is what we're hearing from our grant holders. These are the challenges and opportunities that they're experiencing. These are the ways in which funders can be supporting with that, and so on and so forth. So we are trying to get into a scenario where we can engage in feedback loops, if you like, which allow us to do convening, but also getting impact research out there.
That's really interesting. It literally just answered the question I was going to ask next, which is about the learning from the reports that come through. And so what would be the method for doing that? Like, would that be sharing like on your website so it's available out there, or would it be holding an event and inviting other funders or people working in the sector?
So some of this is to be confirmed because it's new for us. One of the things we've had to do is redesign our grant reporting process. So we had some focus groups of grant holders back in April. We also have been doing some research on what good reporting looks like. And so over the summer, we're going to be putting into place the new process ready for the first cohort of grants to start reporting using this new format from the autumn onwards. Some of it is just like being able to process the data more quickly around outcomes, and it's really simple, but it's really obvious, but we weren't doing it. So, having RAG ratings and a bit of commentary that allow us to see what outcomes are on track or not on track and what might be causing that, and then being able to do some trends analysis relating to that. Other elements, because we are really focused on what it takes to be a good change maker and a change making organisation, are questions that are related to, like, what are the challenges and opportunities you're dealing with as a change making organisation? What are the kinds of things you want us to know and hear and learn as your grant maker? And then again, because we're not asking for kind of war and peace levels of information on that front, being able to again synthesize that information in a live and timely way so that we can get it back out there and say, look, change-making organisations that we're working with are dealing with X, Y and Z. This is the stuff that they want us to know and hear about. And these are the ways in which we think as a sector, as a grant-making sector, we should be responding. And the way that will go out is obviously we want to make sure it gets back out to our grant holders so that they can see that they're part of something bigger. They might not be alone. They might not be the only ones dealing with some of the things that are being highlighted across the different reports that we're receiving throughout the year. But also, we do have a good network of peer organisations, and we would want to get that information out to them as well so that it can form and support their own work. And then obviously we want to use this information to learn from and apply it into our own approach to grant making, both in terms of our decision making at the application stage and beyond.
Right, and I think that leads us nicely on to the next question I was going to ask, which was going to be around trends in grant making practice. What sort of things you've seen in the grant making field? What are the issues?
So I know that there are organisations that are becoming more open to doing multi-year core grant. So that's really good. Some are more comfortable even than that and are doing unrestricted grants. I think there will always be a place and space for a portfolio approach to grant making. So there will be those that do kind of short-term grants, innovation grants, capital grants, project grants. There is a space in place for all of those approaches, and I don't believe it's one size fits all. But it is good to see that the kind of scales are balancing a little bit and you can see more openness to multi-year core cost grants, and long may that continue. I think that's a real positive and an easy thing for funders to do in order to be impactful as well, that we are seeing application numbers increasing. I think that in order to manage that, obviously we have seen some of our peers close or redo their strategies or whatever it might be in order to try and manage that demand. That isn't the approach that we took, although obviously very much understand all of the approaches that people take to try and manage that increasing demand. But just for a bit of context, over the course of our previous strategy, which ran from 22 to 25, ended up with a doubling of our application numbers each year. So we basically went from 250 applications a year to 500 applications a year. And within that time, obviously, our grants budget didn't double and our staff base didn't double. Nothing else doubled. It was just our application numbers. And we were still only able to make about the same number of grants we'd always made. And so one of the decisions we took is that we wanted to be tighter on our eligibility criteria. We used to have a little bit of grey area within our eligibility. And then when we did a deep analysis of the data, we found that even though we had that grey area, we very rarely, if at all, used it. Our trustees often would say no to an application that was operating in the grey area. And so we were like, let's just take it out because it's creating ambiguity and we don't act on it. We live in the grey area. So we made our eligibility criteria a lot tighter. And we've also made the decision to focus our grant making further. We're already quite focused, but we have focused further, hopefully in a way that feels really clear and pertinent to our new strategy. And I hope that people can see why, based on our new strategy for 2025 to 2030, we have changed and updated our funding guidelines in the way that we have done. And we can see that it does mean that our grant making should, over time, if not immediately, reduce in terms of application numbers, but not be any less impactful. Like, we think it's really important not to waste people's time. And when we had a little bit more range in our funding guidelines, a little bit more, well, maybe we could fund this, then people would, of course, make an application. And one of the things we realised when we were considering our new strategy was that we were in a position where within our funding guidelines, there were lots of things we could have funded if we had the funding. Whereas now we're in a position where we're only funding the things that absolutely speak to and meet the ambition of our current strategy. And that feels like the better place to be. It's not so much a trend, but I guess it's something that is worth mentioning. One of the things because we engaged with our grant holders in the development of our new strategy, and they talked a lot about kind of just tell us what you really mean. Don't make us pass things or, read the tea leaves and interpret them correctly or incorrectly, whether we had tea leaf reading abilities. And we have tried to be much clearer about what it is we want to fund and why. And we moved away from funding categories. And I'm not saying that now all of the other funders will do the same. And we shifted instead to trying to back organisations that take a very specific approach. And I've said it several times, but I'll say it one more time, which is change-making organisations at their absolute core, with a focus on advancing justice and doing so in partnership with people and communities. And I don't know if that might become something that happens a little bit more often elsewhere. Like, yes, you can have a cause area, and we do, and I've mentioned those as well. But I do think that funding categories can sometimes make it impossible almost to recognise that so much of what we're doing is interconnected. So, you might be working on polarisation, but it could also be linked to other system factors to do with economic systems and models, for example. So if you have a funding category, it might not be able to capture all of that depth behind the label that you use for the funding category. And that's one of the things that I hope our new approach will enable people to speak a lot more openly and in ways that aren't confined by whatever label or definition we've come up with. So that's a potential trend, but I wouldn't read too much into it. It's just something that we've been trialing and are very open about. And yeah, I think there's probably other things, but I'm cognizant of time, so I'll probably leave it there.
Hey, yeah, I think, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I'm sure there must be loads of funders out there that are doing that thing you mentioned of like having that grey area where they're like, oh, we've got a core area that we're going to fund. And then if we've got some money left over, we'd love to do some other bits over here. But then realistically, there's never any money left after doing the core things. You just end up with applications that are never going to get through realistically.
Exactly.
But yeah, you can see why. Yeah, because people want to have the option, but then realistically in practice, they probably never get to actually exercise it. All right, well, let's wrap up. Is there just one final thing that you'd like fundraisers to understand about your work, if you were to leave us with one final thing to think about?
I'm really cognizant of the fact that there is a power dynamic that exists between funders and those that they fund. We do as much as we're able to try and bridge that dynamic and that gap that can exist. We try and work in really transparent, accountable and effective ways. So try to ensure that there is no kind of secret version of anything. It's all publicly available. It's all as clear as we can make it. We're really open to feedback though. And so we know already that there will be times in which something that feels really clear to us, because we just talk about it all the time and we develop our own kind of shorthand around it, once it gets out into the world, might not be as clear as we think it is, and we hear that feedback and we act on it. Equally, we know that there will be times where we haven't delivered in the way that an organisation wants us to, and we're open to having that conversation and dialogue about it so that we can improve and, prevent these types of things happening again. And so, I think we try and be as accessible as we can be, recognising, of course, that there are 6 of us in total, and so there's only a limit to the amount of time we have available. But we really do believe in working in a way that ensures that we can be a real support and partner to the organisations that we could fund and the organisations that we do go on to fund. And for us, increasingly, whilst there is this power dynamic, we feel that we have a real role to play in making change happen. And obviously our role is giving money to other organisations. It's not necessarily delivering the kind of work that the organisations we fund are doing. But we hope that in time, rather than funders being seen as like on one side of the fence and applicants and the organisations we fund being on the other side of the fence, that there'll be less of a fence and more of a kind of field in which we are all building, developing and ultimately thriving. But we know that we have a role to play in that, and we're doing as much as we can to kind of remove that fence as quickly as possible.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks, really appreciate your time and sharing your thoughts on everything.
Great, well, really appreciated the opportunity to be part of this podcast series. I'm really looking forward to hearing the contributions from all the other speakers too.
Thanks for listening to Inside Grantmaking. If you found this conversation useful, please follow the show wherever you get your podcast. And if you'd like to get in touch, you can find me on LinkedIn or via the Kida Consulting website.